In 1993, on a Hollywood film set, a prop gun was fired and a real man died. Brandon Lee was 28 years old when the bullet hit him during a routine shot. The crew didn't react because no one believed it was real. Brandon Lee collapsed in front of the camera and was pronounced dead 12 hours later, with the film just 8 days away from completion. In a place built on illusion, how did one mistake turn fiction into a real death? In 1993, The Crow was supposed to change everything. For the first time, he wasn't cast because of a last name. He was cast because the role fit him too well. A broken man, violent grief, silence instead of dialogue, rage turned inward. Critics who saw early footage said the same thing. This was not Bruce Lee's son. This was someone else. He trained relentlessly for the role, not to look powerful, but to look empty. He lost weight. He isolated himself. He stayed in character even after the cameras stopped. At 28, after nearly a decade of failed auditions and B-movies, this was the first time Hollywood took him seriously. The numbers mattered. It was his first true leading role, his first film backed by a major studio, and the first time his name appeared without an asterisk. Cast and crew noticed a shift. He spoke less. He smiled less. He talked about the film as if it were a turning point, not a job. Friends later said he felt close to something he had chased his entire life, identity. And then came the cruel irony. The character he played dies and returns. The man playing him never did. Just 8 days before completion, at the exact moment his career was about to begin, everything stopped. So the question isn't why his death shocked Hollywood. The question is this: why did recognition only arrive when it was already too late? Brandon Lee was born in 1965 into a family the world already admired. For the first years of his life, his father was not just a movie star. He was a cultural force. Bruce Lee represented strength, discipline, and something almost mythical. Cameras followed him everywhere. Crowds treated him like something beyond human. To Brandon, he was simply a father. That illusion shattered in 1973. Bruce Lee died suddenly at the age of 32. Brandon was 8 years old. There was no gradual goodbye, no slow preparation. One day his father was alive, powerful and unstoppable. The next day, he was gone. What followed was not just grief, but confusion. A child trying to understand how someone the world called invincible could disappear overnight. Adults around him spoke in hushed tones. Headlines filled the air. Rumors spread. But no explanation could give an 8-year-old a sense of stability. Brandon didn't just lose his father. He lost the only person who could have protected him from what came next. Because Bruce Lee didn't fade after death. He expanded. As the years passed, Bruce Lee became larger than life. His image was replayed, celebrated, analyzed, and mythologized. Movies, documentaries, and martial arts schools kept his presence alive. The world remembered him as a symbol. Brandon remembered him as a man who never came home. This created a quiet imbalance in Brandon's childhood. The more the world celebrated his father, the more alone he felt inside that celebration. People praised Bruce Lee's strength. Few noticed the boy standing beside the legend, growing up without guidance, without a male figure to shape him. From a young age, Brandon learned that grief didn't belong to him alone. His father's death was public property. Everyone felt entitled to it. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone believed they understood what Bruce Lee meant. Almost no one asked what Brandon had lost. At school, his last name preceded him. Teachers knew it. Classmates whispered it. Strangers looked at him with curiosity, not kindness. He wasn't seen as a child learning who he was. He was seen as an extension of someone else. This pressure didn't come with cruelty. It came with expectation. And expectation can be heavier than hate. People didn't demand he succeed. They assumed he would. They didn't encourage him to explore. They waited for him to resemble something familiar. Slowly, quietly, Brandon learned that being ordinary was not an option available to him. He became reserved, observant, careful with words. While other children experimented freely, Brandon learned to measure himself. He became aware of how he was seen, long before he understood who he actually was. The absence of his father created another problem that would follow him for decades. Brandon never had the chance to disagree with Bruce Lee, never had the chance to rebel against him, never had the chance to define himself in opposition. That conflict, so common, so necessary, was taken from him. Instead, Bruce Lee became perfect in memory, untouchable, frozen in time. And how does a son compete with a man who never aged, never failed publicly, and never grew old? By his teenage years, Brandon understood something painful. He was not expected to discover himself. He was expected to continue something. The world didn't want his individuality. It wanted familiarity. That realization didn't make him angry. It made him cautious. He learned to hold back, to observe before acting, to protect a private self that very few people were allowed to see. Because somewhere deep inside, Brandon Lee knew the truth the world refused to acknowledge. He was not born to inherit a legend. He was born as a person who never got the chance to grow up with his father, and that absence would quietly shape every decision he made from that moment forward. So the question that lingered at the end of his childhood was never about talent or destiny. It was far simpler and far more devastating. How do you become yourself when the world only wants a memory? By the time Brandon Lee reached his teenage years, the world had already decided who he was supposed to become, not through cruelty, through assumption. His last name carried more weight than his personality ever could. People didn't ask what he wanted to do. They waited to see when he would do it. Martial arts followed him everywhere, not because he sought it, but because others expected it. Every conversation drifted back to his father. Every compliment contained comparison. Every opportunity came with an unspoken condition, resemblance. Hollywood didn't see a young man trying to discover himself. It saw unfinished business. When Brandon began exploring acting, the path ahead looked clear to everyone except him. Action films, fighting roles, silent intensity. That was the template left behind by Bruce Lee. And Hollywood doesn't like deviation from templates that once made money. Brandon felt the pressure immediately. Casting rooms didn't ask him to read lines. They asked him to move, to kick, to punch, to embody something familiar. When he tried to bring nuance or vulnerability, it was often ignored. Producers didn't want interpretation. They wanted inheritance. This created a quiet war inside him. On one side was opportunity. On the other was identity. Accepting these roles meant visibility. Refusing them meant obscurity. And for a young actor with no safety net, obscurity could end a career before it ever began. So he compromised. Brandon trained in martial arts, not out of obsession, but necessity. He studied discipline, the way someone studies a foreign language they never want to speak. He became competent, impressive even, but the satisfaction never followed. Because every skill he developed only tightened comparison. He wasn't being measured against other actors. He was being measured against a myth. And myths don't age. They don't doubt. They don't lose momentum. Bruce Lee remained permanently young, permanently powerful, permanently undefeated in public memory. Brandon, meanwhile, was expected to grow under that shadow without ever being allowed to contradict it. The psychological toll was subtle but constant. Brandon learned to edit himself in conversations. He avoided talking about his father, not out of resentment, but exhaustion. Every mention reopened a comparison. He could never win. People spoke about Bruce Lee with reverence. Brandon listened with quiet detachment. At times, he tried to run from the legacy entirely. He moved, changed circles, focused on acting technique rather than physicality. He studied drama, voice, character work, anything that would allow him to be evaluated as an actor, not an echo. But Hollywood rarely forgets what it wants you to be. Offers came in waves. Low-budget action films, martial arts-heavy roles, projects that leaned heavily on the name Lee for marketing. The scripts were thin, the characters disposable, the expectations rigid. Brandon took some of them, not because he believed in them, but because survival demanded momentum. Each role brought exposure. Each exposure brought the same critique. He's good, but not his father. He has talent, but lacks the presence. He moves well, but doesn't have the magic. What they called magic was something Bruce Lee had forged over decades. What they demanded from Brandon was replication. This created a dangerous internal split. Professionally, he was moving forward. Personally, he felt stalled. He was visible but unseen, employed but undefined, known but misunderstood. Friends later described him as thoughtful, introspective, quietly frustrated. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing permission to exist without comparison. The irony was cruel. The harder he worked to be taken seriously, the more he was reminded of who he wasn't. Every success was framed as proximity to Bruce Lee, never distance from him. By his mid-20s, Brandon faced a decision he could no longer delay: continue accepting roles that kept him trapped in the shadow, or risk everything for a chance to be evaluated on his own terms. He knew the cost. Refusing familiar roles meant fewer offers, less money, less visibility. But continuing meant erasing himself slowly, role by role. So he began saying no, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change direction. He looked for material that carried emotional weight, characters defined by loss, not strength, silence, not spectacle, pain, not dominance. He wanted roles that couldn't be mistaken for imitation. Hollywood didn't immediately respond, but eventually something appeared. A script that didn't ask him to fight like his father. A character that didn't demand resemblance. A story built on grief, identity, and resurrection. And for the first time, Brandon Lee felt something unfamiliar. Hope, because if he could survive long enough to make the right choice, he believed the shadow might finally break. The question was whether Hollywood would allow him that chance, or whether the shadow would close in first. When Brandon Lee officially stepped into Hollywood, he quickly learned that ambition alone was not enough. Talent opened doors. A famous last name opened them wider, but neither guaranteed respect. The offers that came his way followed a familiar pattern: low-budget action films, martial arts-driven roles, characters written to punch, kick, and disappear. They weren't asking who Brandon Lee was. They were asking how closely he could resemble something already proven. For a young actor trying to build momentum, refusing work wasn't an option, so he accepted roles he didn't believe in, not because he wanted them, but because survival in Hollywood demands visibility. A disappearing actor is quickly replaced. These early projects gave him screen time, but little dignity. The scripts were thin, the characters forgettable, the direction uninspired. Critics noticed his effort, but rarely his intention. Reviews repeated the same sentence in different forms: promising, but not exceptional. What they meant was simple: he wasn't Bruce Lee. Behind the scenes, Brandon worked harder than anyone saw. He studied acting seriously, took classes, focused on voice control, emotional restraint, and internal pacing. He wanted to build characters from the inside out, not from physical movement alone. But Hollywood rewarded spectacle, not subtlety. Auditions became repetitive, rooms filled with executives who already had an image in mind. Brandon would walk in knowing the outcome before speaking a word. If he leaned into emotion, he was told he lacked power. If he showed physical dominance, he was dismissed as imitation. There was no winning position. This period carved something sharp into his personality. He became disciplined but guarded, friendly but distant. He stopped talking about dreams and focused on execution. He understood that complaining would only mark him as difficult. Privately, the frustration grew. Friends noticed his exhaustion, not physical but existential. He wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of becoming irrelevant before he ever had the chance to define himself. The industry didn't help. Studios used his last name when it benefited them and ignored him when it didn't. Marketing leaned on legacy. Casting leaned on familiarity. Responsibility for his success was always framed as inheritance, never effort. This created a dangerous contradiction. Brandon was working constantly, yet moving nowhere. Every role added footage he resumed, but none added weight to his identity. At times, he considered leaving Hollywood altogether, not out of bitterness, but clarity. He understood something many actors learn too late. Fame without authorship is hollow. Recognition without self-definition is suffocating. Still, he stayed. Because somewhere inside, Brandon believed the right role existed, one that couldn't be mistaken for mimicry, one that required stillness instead of aggression, a character defined by loss rather than dominance. He didn't talk about this hope openly. He carried it quietly. Rejection after rejection forced him to lower expectations, not ambition. He waited, watched, prepared. By his mid-20s, something shifted. Directors began noticing his restraint, his ability to communicate grief without speech, his presence in silence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. But the camera didn't ignore him. Then a script appeared that didn't mention martial arts once. It was dark, minimal, violent, but emotionally heavy. A story about grief, revenge, and identity. A man resurrected by pain rather than power. Brandon read it and felt something immediate. Recognition, not of opportunity, but of alignment. This wasn't a role written for a legend son. It was written for someone who understood loss. For the first time, Brandon Lee didn't see a comparison waiting at the end of the page. He saw a door, and he knew he might only get one chance to walk through it. The question was whether Hollywood would let him reach the other side, or take everything away before he could. When Brandon Lee committed to Crow, something changed in the way he approached his work. This was no longer about survival or momentum. This was about alignment. For the first time, the role didn't ask him to prove anything. It asked him to feel something. Eric Draven was a man defined by absence. His fiancée was murdered. His life was stolen. What remained was grief. So deep it refused to die, that grief pulled him back from the grave, not as a hero, but as a witness to violence and loss. The character didn't move like a fighter. He moved like someone carrying weight. Brandon understood that weight instinctively. Instead of building muscle, he stripped himself down. He lost weight. His posture changed. His movements slowed. He spent long hours alone, studying the emotional rhythm of the character rather than the physical one. Crew members later described him as focused, quiet, and distant, not unfriendly, just elsewhere. He stayed in character longer than expected, not method acting in the traditional sense, but emotional containment. He limited social interaction on set. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was often about tone, pacing, and silence. He cared deeply about what the camera would catch between words. This mattered because The Crow was built on atmosphere. Rain-soaked streets, broken buildings, empty rooms. The film didn't rely on dialogue to explain pain. It relied on presence. And Brandon delivered that presence with restraint rather than force. Early footage surprised people. Producers who expected an action performance saw something else entirely. A stillness that felt intentional. A sadness that wasn't performative. Critics who later saw rough cuts noted the same thing. Brandon Lee didn't look like a man playing grief. He looked like someone who had lived with it. For Brandon, this role represented more than a breakthrough. It was separation. For the first time, no one mentioned his father during production meetings. No one adjusted scenes to resemble Bruce Lee's style. The comparison stopped, not because people were being kind, but because they no longer fit. He was finally being judged on his own terms. Privately, Brandon talked about the film as a turning point. Friends recalled him saying this was the first project where he felt understood by the material. He spoke about the character with unusual seriousness, as if aware that this role carried weight beyond career implications. At 28 years old, after nearly a decade of small films and quiet disappointment, Brandon believed this was the moment his life would change direction, not toward superstardom, but toward legitimacy. He didn't want to be iconic. He wanted to be credible. But there was another shift happening beneath the surface. The emotional toll of the role was heavier than he expected. The constant immersion in grief began to bleed into his off-screen life. Crew members noticed his mood darkening. He laughed less. He slept poorly. The line between performance and reality blurred quietly, without drama. Some of his comments unsettled people in hindsight. Casual remarks about death, about fate, about how fragile things felt. At the time, they were brushed off as dark humor, the kind that circulates on intense film sets. No one saw warning signs, or perhaps no one wanted to. The production itself was already under pressure. Budget constraints, tight schedules. Night shoots that stretched endlessly. Exhaustion became routine. Safety protocols existed, but corners were quietly cut to stay on track. And Brandon, fully invested in the role, trusted the process. He trusted the people around him. He trusted the system. He trusted that the illusion would remain an illusion. What no one realized was that the atmosphere of the Crow, the darkness, the tension, the fatigue, was quietly building towards something irreversible. And Brandon Lee was standing at the center of it, believing he had finally stepped out of the shadow, just days before the film would be completed. As production moved deeper into its final weeks, the atmosphere on the set of The Crow began to change. The schedule tightened. Night shoots stacked on top of each other. Fatigue became constant, not exceptional. People worked on instinct more than attention. For Brandon Lee, the pressure didn't come from fear. It came from focus. He was locked into the role, emotionally and mentally. He believed in the film. He believed it mattered. And because of that belief, he trusted the environment around him without question. Several crew members later recalled small moments that felt insignificant at the time. Brandon speaking quietly about how strange it felt to be playing a man who dies and returns. Brandon mentioning fate in passing, half joking, half serious. Brandon acknowledging how physically exhausted everyone was, but insisting they push through. None of it sounded like a warning. It sounded like commitment. The production itself had already made compromises. Budget limitations meant fewer resources. Time pressure meant faster decisions. Safety protocols existed on paper, but enforcement depended on vigilance. And vigilance fades when exhaustion becomes normal. Firearms were part of the film's visual language. Guns appeared in multiple scenes. They were treated as tools, not threats. Props that had been used safely countless times before. No one expected danger from something so familiar. On the day of the accident in March 1993, the set moved like it always did. Crew members adjusted lighting. Camera positions were locked. The weapon was prepared off camera. No dramatic tension. No sense of impending disaster. The scene required a gun to be fired toward Brandon. It was supposed to be a controlled illusion. A prop gun. A blank. Nothing more. But the illusion was already compromised. A series of overlooked details, miscommunication, and procedural shortcuts had quietly aligned. A fragment left inside the barrel. A failure to properly inspect the weapon. Assumptions made because nothing had gone wrong before. When the gun fired, no one reacted immediately because no one believed anything real had happened. Brandon fell. The moment didn't register as danger. Crew members thought he was acting. Even when he didn't stand back up, the delay felt routine. Film sets are full of pauses, retakes, adjustments. Only when confusion replaced expectation did reality begin to surface. The damage was catastrophic. Brandon Lee had been struck by a projectile driven by the force of the blank. The injury was internal, invisible at first glance. By the time the severity was understood, time had already been lost. He was rushed to the hospital. Emergency surgery followed. Doctors worked for hours. The crew waited, stunned, trying to reconcile what had just happened with what they believed was impossible. 12 hours later, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. The set shut down instantly. Silence replaced noise. Questions replaced routine. The illusion collapsed. What had been treated as harmless became lethal in hindsight. The investigation that followed focused on mechanics, not meaning. Reports detailed failures, safety oversights, chain reactions of negligence. No single villain, no single moment. Just a system that assumed control instead of confirming it. For Hollywood, the tragedy became procedural. New safety rules, revised guidelines, meetings, memos. For Brandon Lee, there was no revision. The film was nearly complete. Only 8 days of shooting remained. In a decision that still divides opinion, production eventually resumed using body doubles and visual effects. The film was finished, released, praised. The Crow became a cult classic. Brandon Lee became a symbol. But symbols are easy. Understanding is harder. He had spent his entire life trying to escape a shadow, trying to be evaluated as a person rather than an inheritance. And in the moment when that escape finally seemed possible, the system he trusted failed him. His death wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't poetic. It was preventable. And that is what makes it unbearable. Because in the end, Brandon Lee didn't die chasing danger. He died believing the danger was fake. The role that finally allowed him to be himself was also the role that took everything away. So the question that remains isn't about fate or curses or mythology. It's much simpler. How many times does a system have to be careless before a life becomes a cost? The moment Brandon Lee was pronounced dead, Hollywood froze. Briefly, sets went quiet. Phones stopped ringing. For a few hours, the industry that never sleeps stood still, unsure how to speak about a death that should never have happened. He was 28 years old. He had died doing his job, and no one had intended to hurt him. That final detail became the center of everything that followed. News spread quickly. Headlines avoided emotion and leaned on language like tragic accident and unfortunate incident. The framing mattered. It softened the blow. It redirected attention away from responsibility and toward inevitability. Accidents happen. Mistakes occur. Systems fail quietly. For those who had been on set, the shock was paralyzing. Crew members replayed the moment repeatedly in their minds. The delay, the disbelief, the realization that came too late. Many would later describe the same feeling, a hollow confusion that didn't fade when the cameras stopped rolling. But grief in Hollywood is measured in time. Production on The Crow was halted immediately. Lawyers arrived. Investigations began. Statements were drafted. Meetings replaced mourning. The questions asked were not philosophical. They were logistical. What failed? Who missed what? How to proceed? The human cause sat quietly in the background. Brandon Lee's family faced a reality that felt cruelly familiar. 2 decades earlier, they had buried Bruce Lee just as suddenly, just as unexpectedly. Once again, explanations felt insufficient. Once again, the world demanded answers faster than grief could provide. The funeral was private. There were no grand public ceremonies, no spectacle. Those closest to Brandon remembered him not as a rising star, but as a thoughtful, introspective man who spent most of his life trying not to be defined by a name. Hollywood sent flowers, messages, condolences written in careful language, sympathy without ownership. Behind closed doors, the industry faced an uncomfortable truth. This death was not caused by recklessness or thrill-seeking. It was caused by assumption, by the belief that protocols, once written, no longer needed vigilance, by the illusion that experience replaces caution. Investigators traced the failure back through layers of oversight: a prop weapon mishandled, a barrel not properly checked, safety procedures treated as routine rather than mandatory. Each step alone seemed small. Together, they became fatal. No single person was charged criminally. No public trial followed. Responsibility dissolved into process. Process dissolved into policy updates. New rules were introduced. Training manuals revised. Meetings held. Hollywood learned. Structurally, emotionally, it moved on. The most controversial decision came months later. The Crow would be completed, using body doubles, visual effects, careful editing. The remaining 8 days of footage would be reconstructed without Brandon. It was framed as a tribute, a way to honor his work, a promise that his final performance would be seen. But for many, the decision felt unsettling. The industry that failed to protect him now relied on technology to erase his absence. The illusion returned. The system corrected itself. The machine continued. When The Crow was finally released, audiences responded with intensity. The film was dark, raw, and emotionally resonant. Critics praised Brandon's performance as haunting, magnetic, different from anything he had done before. Ironically, it was a recognition he had waited his entire life for, and he was not alive to receive it. Posters carried his face. Reviews analyzed his restraint. Fans spoke about his potential. The same industry that had struggled to see him now elevated him to cult status. This created a painful contradiction. Brandon Lee became most visible only after he was gone. Hollywood remembered him as a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a footnote in conversations about safety. But for those who knew him, that framing felt incomplete. He was not a symbol. He was a person who trusted a system that failed him. And that failure was quickly absorbed, categorized, and archived. The silence that followed was not malicious. It was procedural, because Hollywood doesn't mourn indefinitely. It pauses, then it continues. The question that lingered wasn't about blame anymore. It was about memory. How long does an industry remember the cost of a life before routine takes over again? The funeral of Brandon Lee was quiet, intentionally so. There were no cameras lining the streets, no public spectacle. The people who gathered were those who had known him before the headlines, friends, family, and a handful of colleagues who understood that what had been lost was not a symbol, but a person. He was buried beside his father. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. 2 lives cut short, 2 deaths surrounded by questions. 2 men remembered more loudly after they were gone than when they were alive. For the Lee family, the pain felt cyclical, as if history had folded in on itself. Public reaction arrived in waves. Fans expressed shock. Articles revisited the details of the accident. Online discussion speculated about responsibility, fate, and patterns that felt unsettling. Some searched for meaning, others searched for blame. Many simply watched from a distance, unsure how to process a death that didn't fit a narrative of recklessness or excess. There were no scandals to dissect, no moral failures to condemn, just a mistake that ended a life. And mistakes are uncomfortable because they suggest fragility. Hollywood responded carefully. Studios released statements reaffirming commitment to safety. Industry groups emphasized updated protocols. The language was calm, measured, forward-looking. It acknowledged loss without dwelling on it. What went largely unspoken was how easily the tragedy blended into history. Within months, new films filled schedules, new sets assembled, new productions reused prop weapons under revised guidelines. The machinery of entertainment resumed its rhythm. The memory of Brandon Lee became something discussed in past tense, attached to policy changes rather than personal loss. The Crow continued its journey without him. When the film premiered, audiences sensed something different. There was weight in Brandon's performance, a restraint that felt deliberate, a sadness that lingered longer than the story required. Viewers didn't always know why it felt heavy. They just felt it. Critics praised his presence. Many called it his breakthrough, his defining role, the one that proved he had finally separated himself from his father's shadow. That recognition arrived too late. Brandon Lee became part of a lineage of artists whose potential was discussed as theory rather than experience. What he might have done, where his career might have gone, who he might have become if time had been allowed to continue. Those questions had no answers. The industry framed his legacy around caution, around lessons learned, around procedures updated. But for those closest to him, legacy was quieter. It lived in memories of conversations, of humor, of a man who didn't seek attention, only clarity. Years passed. His name appeared less frequently. New tragedies replaced old ones. The context shifted. Brandon Lee's death became a reference point rather than a presence. Something mentioned when discussing safety, not when discussing art. And that, perhaps, was a final injustice. He had spent his entire life trying to be seen as himself, not as a reflection, not as an inheritance, not as a continuation of someone else's myth. He came closest to achieving that in the moment the world lost him. There was no conspiracy in his death, no curse, no grand design, just a system that assumed control instead of confirming it, and a man who trusted that assumption. Brandon Lee did not die chasing danger. He died believing danger was contained. That illusion, the belief that systems always work as intended, is what failed him. In the end, Hollywood learned how to protect itself better. It did not learn how to grieve longer. The silence that followed was not cruel. It was efficient. And efficiency as a way of erasing people once their absence no longer disrupts the schedule. So the question that remains isn't about blame or fate. It's about memory. How many lives does an industry absorb before it stops feeling the weight of loss at all? After Brandon Lee died, his career stopped at a place most actors only reach years later. Not at exhaustion, not at decline, but at potential. untested, unfinished, and impossible to measure. That is what makes his legacy uncomfortable. Hollywood is used to narratives of rise and fall, stardom followed by excess, genius followed by self-destruction. Brandon Lee didn't fit any of them. He didn't implode. He didn't spiral. He didn't burn out. He was interrupted. In the months following the release of The Crow, conversations began to shift. Critics who had once dismissed him reevaluated his work. Performances that were previously overlooked were now examined with seriousness. The same restraint that once felt muted was now described as intentional, controlled, mature. Ironically, Brandon Lee became visible only when the question of comparison no longer mattered. Because once he was gone, there was no one left to compare. His performance in The Crow aged differently than expected. What initially appeared as stylized darkness began to feel intimate. His stillness read as grief rather than posing. The silence he carried on screen felt lived in. Viewers sensed that something deeper was present, even if they couldn't name it. Over time, the film gained cult status, not because of spectacle, but because of atmosphere, because of mood, because of the weight Brandon brought to the role without explanation. For many viewers, The Crow became inseparable from its context. Knowing how Brandon died changed how the film was experienced. Lines felt heavier. Moments lingered longer. The character's resurrection carried an irony that never faded. But legacy built on tragedy is fragile. As years passed, Brandon Lee's name became increasingly attached to hypothetical paths rather than concrete achievements. Articles speculated about where his career might have gone, which directors might have worked with him, what genres he might have explored. Those speculations were endless and meaningless because possibility is not proof. What The Crow did prove, however, was something quieter. Brandon Lee had presence, not dominance, not charisma in the traditional sense, but an ability to hold attention without demanding it. He understood restraint in a medium obsessed with excess. That skill suggested a different kind of future. Had he lived, it's unlikely Brandon would have become a conventional action star. His strengths pointed elsewhere, toward darker, character-driven roles, toward stories centered on loss, moral ambiguity, and internal conflict. He was not built for spectacle. He was built for atmosphere, and atmosphere ages well. That possibility haunted the industry in subtle ways. Casting directors later acknowledged that Brandon had been misjudged early in his career, that the focus on lineage had blinded them to his actual strengths, his emotional intelligence, his patience with silence. But acknowledgments after death changed nothing. What remained was a sense of absence, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Brandon Lee left behind no long filmography to analyze, no transformation arc to chart, only a single performance that suggested more than it delivered. For audiences, this created a unique relationship with his work. The Crow wasn't just a film. It became a threshold, a glimpse into a career that never unfolded. And that glimpse raised a question that had no resolution. If Brandon Lee had been allowed to live past the moment he finally became himself, would the industry have followed him? Or would it have eventually pulled him back into the shadow he fought so hard to escape? The tragedy of his legacy is not that it ended early. It's that it ended exactly when it started to make sense. As the years passed, the conversation around Brandon Lee slowly shifted from shock to silence. His name appeared less frequently in headlines. New generations discovered The Crow without knowing the full story behind it. To some, he became a cult icon. To others, a footnote tied to a tragic accident. But for those who looked closer, his legacy lived in something harder to define. It lived in restraint. In an industry addicted to noise, Brandon Lee's most powerful moments were quiet. He didn't dominate the screen. He inhabited it. His presence didn't demand attention. It invited it. That quality, rare at the time, would later become more valued as cinema evolved towards psychological depth and emotional realism. Had he lived, Brandon Lee would not have fit neatly into the blockbuster era that followed the 1990s. His strengths were not built for spectacle-driven franchises. They were suited for characters shaped by internal conflict, moral ambiguity, and emotional consequence, roles that Hollywood didn't fully understand until much later. Actors who rose in the decades after him built careers on qualities Brandon already possessed: stillness, vulnerability, an ability to express grief without explanation. Watching those performances now, some observers quietly wonder how Brandon Lee might have navigated that same landscape. But speculation never replaces presence. What makes his absence particularly painful is that Brandon never reached the point where he could choose freely. He never had the chance to reject roles from a position of security, never had the luxury of redefining himself after success. His career was always moving uphill, never allowed to plateau. That matters, because artists often do their most interesting work after they stop proving themselves. Brandon Lee died before that moment arrived. His legacy, therefore, is not defined by volume, but by implication. One performance that suggested a future. One role that demonstrated separation from inheritance. One brief moment where he was no longer framed as someone's son, but as someone complete. And then nothing. There were no scandals to overshadow him. No controversies to complicate his memory. No self-destruction to reinterpret his choices. His story ended cleanly, abruptly, without moral resolution. That lack of narrative closure unsettles people. We prefer stories with lessons, with warnings, with causes and effects we can trace. Brandon Lee's life offers none of that comfort. He did everything right. He worked patiently. He waited. He chose carefully. And still he died. This reality forces an uncomfortable reflection, not about fate or curses, but about systems, about how easily individuals are lost inside structures designed for efficiency, about how talent and caution are not always enough to survive environments built on assumption. Brandon Lee trusted the process. He trusted that safeguards existed. That experience replaced risk. That illusion would remain illusion. His death exposed how fragile that belief was. Today, his name is occasionally mentioned alongside other onset tragedies, as an example, as a reference, as justification for improved safety. That may be the most practical outcome of his loss. But practicality does not equal remembrance. The deeper legacy of Brandon Lee lies in a quieter place, in the idea that some people never get the time they need to become visible. That recognition often arrives too late to matter, that the distance between obscurity and legitimacy can be razor thin, and sometimes fatal. He did not leave behind a long list of achievements. He left behind a question. What would have happened if time had simply been allowed to continue? That question has no answer. And perhaps that is the final weight of his legacy. Not what he became, not what he accomplished, but what the world never gave him the chance to finish. Brandon Lee did not spend his life trying to become a legend. He spent it trying to become visible. Not louder, not stronger, just separate. Separate from a name that arrived before him. Separate from expectations he never asked for. He did everything the right way. He waited. He worked quietly. He chose a role that finally fit who he was, not who the world wanted him to resemble. And at the exact moment that choice began to make sense, the story stopped. There was no moral failure to explain his death. No excess, no recklessness. Just a system that assumed control instead of confirming it. A belief that familiarity equals safety. An illusion that had worked until it didn't. That is what makes a story uncomfortable, because it offers no lesson that protects us, no behavior to avoid, no clear warning. Brandon Lee didn't die because he pushed too far. He died because he trusted that everything around him was under control, and that trust was misplaced. In the years since, his name has been remembered softly, attached to a single performance, a single film, a single moment where the world finally saw him as himself. Not a son, not a shadow, just a man on the edge of becoming. That edge is where his story remains suspended, not as a tragedy to exploit, not as a myth to expand, but as a quiet reminder. Sometimes the most devastating loss isn't potential wasted. It's potential finally found and taken away before it is time to live.